Hello, good afternoon, buongiorno. Welcome to another in Save Venice's ongoing series of education and enrichment lectures, webinars. I'm Christopher Apostle. I'm the director of the Projects Committee of Save Venice. I want to welcome all of you for joining us today. I see people are still coming in, but for all of you who are Save Venice members, patrons, supporters, welcome today, and thank you for joining us for what I think will be a very interesting and exciting webinar about a subject that is especially exciting and interesting to me, dedicated to the ongoing projects that we're doing for our anniversary, and in particular, the Scuola Italiana. We are, as many of you know, turning 50 this year. We're still a young organization, but very vibrant, very active, and as a result, celebrating 50 years was something that we needed to take very seriously and take on two exciting projects. Our other anniversary project, as many of you know, is the mosaics in the apse of Torcello, the church at Torcello, which is very much the cradle of the city of Venice. And the other project, which we're discussing really today in our first dedicated presentation, is the Scuola Italiana, the Italian synagogue in the ghetto in Venice. Built in 1575, the Scuola Italiana was founded for the Italcum, or the Italian Rite community of Jews living in Rome. You will be able to see the exterior. It is a clandestine synagogue. That means it is not an obvious place of worship from the outside. This is from the Campo of the Ghetto Nuovo, looking up, and then you could think that the top layer was maybe just a large apartment or something else, but is in fact a synagogue. Part of the project, as you can see, the exterior is needing in some work with the plastering, the surface, etc. The windows aren't opening. There are leaks in the roof, etc. that need to be dealt with. But now if we go into the interior, you can see what is there. An incredibly beautiful late Cinquecento interior. The ceiling is I think, very typical of that period. But like all places of worship in Venice and all of the synagogues in the ghetto, various generations updated their place of worship to sort of stay in fashion. You can see it looks very beautiful, and you're sort of wondering, well, what would we possibly need to do in an interior like this? But if we go to the next slide, I can just show you some of the issues that are really being in need of some care. Up on the left side, you see above the Aaron, the Ark of the Torah, some water damage, as is so often the problem in Venice, and you can see it in the dedicated plaster inscription in the middle slide. And on the right, you see peeling on the various architectural issues, issues with the architectural elements in the interior caused by water, damp, just age and centuries of painting and overpainting and sort of covering over issues. So these are some of the things we'll be dealing with. If we go to the next slide, you can also see a view of the bima, where the officiant would stand to read and to preach and communicate with the congregation. You can see on the right, it's not so easy to see from this angle, but there is a beautiful terrazzo floor. Part of this section was redone in the 18th century, and there is a very uneven floor there. And indeed, the floor of the whole synagogue, we're looking at to see if there is, under the modern floor put in the 70s, if there's not something original underneath. So there's quite a bit of work to do there. And so today's talk really fits very nicely in with what we will be doing there. So before I continue, I just want to thank some of you already have been to this site and have already been supporting it. We already have 30 donors. So many people have come and already gotten involved. So we're very grateful already. Without much ado, I thought I would go ahead and to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Dana E. Katz. And Dana is the professor of art history and humanities at Reed College in Oregon, where she teaches courses in pre-modern art and architectural history. Her research explores representations of religious difference in the art and culture of early modern Europe. Katz is the author of The Jew in the Art of the Italian Renaissance, and I'm going to plug books for her. So here's that book, very, very interesting book. And perhaps even more relevant for our discussion today, published in 2017, The Jewish Ghetto and the Visual Imagination of Early Modern Europe. And this is a very interesting book, and I recommend reading it. It's not terribly long, but it's very interesting and something that I think added a lot to my understanding of this subject and the Scuola Italiana that we're dedicating this talk to today. Dana is now working on a new book project, actually entitled Materials of Islam in Pre-Modern Europe. Is also something probably that fits very neatly with Venice and the history of Venice. I want to remind all of you that we will be taking questions at the end of this webinar. So if you would like to use the chat function at the bottom, you will be able to send in some questions and we'll have time, and Dana and I will come back on and try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have today. But without further ado, I want to welcome and thank Dana Katz, who will present to us her lecture, Questioning Quarantine in the Jewish Ghetto of Venice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for that introduction. I am thrilled to be able to participate in an event that helps support the restoration of the Scuola Italiana in the Jewish Ghetto of Venice. I was in Venice 2 summers ago, the summer before the pandemic, working on my new book project on Islam. And at that time, Melissa Kahn at Save Venice reached out to me. And I remember meeting Melissa in the Campo del Ghetto Nuovo on a warm Venetian afternoon. And as she escorted me into the Scuola Italiana, I told her that this was the first time that I was in that particular Venetian synagogue. I have visited the others on tours or to attend religious services, but the Scuola Italiana was inaccessible precisely because it's in need of restoration. So I'm so grateful to Save Venice and the Jewish community in Venice that they're now turning their restorative eye to the Scuola Italiana. Grazie mille. All right, I am now going to share screen. And again, my title is Questioning Quarantine in the Jewish Ghetto of Venice. So with that title, I'm going to think through our present circumstance with the global pandemic. As the year 2020 came to a close, the New York Times looked back at the 20 phrases that defined this unprecedented year. Unsurprisingly, one of the words was unprecedented, a buzzword that took hold of US advertising and US politics to mark an extraordinary year filled with racial rioting, election anxieties, wildfires, and of course, the global coronavirus pandemic. Among the COVID-inspired terms to arise in 2020, Times journalist Tim Herrera remarks that the word pod made a strong showing in institutional practice and daily behavior in the United States. Pod garnered new meaning this past year, as in Herrera's words, Americans decided no thanks to a genuine, strict, and enforced quarantine. We settled for limiting in-person socializing to only a small group of friends and family. The concept of quarantine begot a series of related and playful words, including quarantine, as you see here, and of course, quarantini, the preferred drink of virtual happy hours. From the early weeks of the global lockdown in March 2020, a year ago actually today, until the early days of this new year in 2021, the word quarantine has peppered our everyday language. No longer restricted to hospitals, this terminology is now uttered in the cities, towns, and villages throughout the world by mothers and fathers, teachers and students, bus drivers, and their passengers. The etymology of the word quarantine, in the sense of isolation imposed to prevent the spread of disease, has its origins in 14th century Venice and denotes a period of 40 days, or 40 giorni, in which authorities ordered the isolation of ships during outbreaks of the plague. As historian of medicine Hannah Marcus remarks, city officials during the Renaissance, faced with recurring bouts of plague, developed our statistical approach to tracking outbreaks. From the 1450s in Milan to the 1530s in Venice, all deaths in these cities were systematically recorded to monitor outbreaks. The enforced immobility resulting from the COVID-19 crisis, with the closing of borders, suspensions of visas, and cancellations of flights, is deeply embedded in the public health policies and politics of late medieval Venice. Venice's precarious position on the marshy lagoon islands of the northern Adriatic offered the city protection against hostile neighbors, but it made it vulnerable to contagion. Venice was a city whose geographic isolation and limited natural resources required contact with the outside world. Venetians were compelled to cultivate long-distance trade relations and welcome foreigners to their shores. In early modernity, Venice teamed with the non-Venetian. Merchants, lace makers, clothing sellers, bankers, tourists, doctors, and diplomats visited the city. Because of its status as a leading Mediterranean trading center, Venice was particularly vulnerable to infectious disease. In 1424, city officials responded to that vulnerability with the erection of the Lazaretto, the mandatory quarantine hospital for Venice's plague-stricken, on a remote island near the island of the Lido. In later decades, Venetians erected a second Lazaretto known as the Lazaretto Nuovo. These two restricted quarantine zones served to protect the city from the spread of disease. As art historian Lisa Pon writes, in general, the former, the Lazaretto Vecchio, was for the plague-stricken. The latter, the Lazaretto Nuovo, was for those who were suspected of being contagious with the plague, the crew, passengers, and cargo from ships arriving from places where plague was suspected. During devastating outbreaks of the plague, other lagoonal islands, San Clemente, San Lazzaro, San Secondo, functioned as overflow spaces for the Lazaretto Vecchio and the Lazaretto Nuovo. And here I'm showing you Benedetto Bordone's book of the islands of the world. And here you'll see a kind of condensed version of Venice here in the center, and all around it, circumscribing it, are the little islands, including the Lazaretto Vecchio here, and the Lazaretto Nuovo here, and these other little lagoonal islands that served as overflow spaces, including San Lazzaro, when the plague was particularly catastrophic. The Board of Health permitted only the patients who recovered to return to Venice proper. Venice placed great stress on the value of quarantine. Venetians attempted to protect city boundaries through the strict isolation of infection on small remote islands to contain the contagion. Today, I'd like to explore the concept of quarantine as it relates to another form of enforced residential restriction, and that, of course, is Venice's Jewish ghetto. The xenophobia detected with the outbreak of COVID-19 has its historical antecedents in medieval Europe, where outbreaks of epidemic disease transformed into allegations against vulnerable social outgroups, most notably the Jews. Whereas plague-spreading conspiracies in medieval Europe resulted in the burning of Jews for accusations of poisoning wells or tampering with food supplies, Early modern Venice instead offered Jews residence in the newly constructed Ghetto Nuovo in the northernmost district of Cannaregio. And here I'm showing you Jacopo de Barbri's famous map of Venice, and I've placed here a marker that shows where the ghetto is, here in the northernmost region of Cannaregio. The ghetto offered Jews a home. However, it did so by disenfranchising them from privilege and power. Venetian authorities used ghetto architecture to mark off and wall up the city's Jews. In Venice, the governance and administration of Jews took architectonic form. The ghetto's architectural anatomy, its soaring walls, which you see here, and surveilled gates, speak to the structural isolation in Venice that quieted concerns between state and faith. Yet ghettoization was not analogous to the enforced quarantine isolation of the plague-stricken in the Lazaretto. The ghetto never required complete isolation. Ghetto enclosure was predicated on the Jews' bodily movement through the daily opening and closing of the ghetto's guarded gates. Place matters. Venetian authorities deliberated over the location of the ghetto, of the Jews' ghetto. The siting of the Venice ghetto was a question of debate among the city's powerful politicians. According to the diaries of Marin Sanudo, on April 23rd, 1515, Giorgio Emo recommended to the Collegio, and here I quote, that the Jews, many of whom living in this land are in various houses and quarters, setting a bad example for all Christians, should be sent to live on the island of Giudecca. And here I'm showing you, of course, Giovanni Merlo's map of Venice, and here is the Giudecca here. And again, the ghetto was placed here. The Jewish community met Emo's proposal with fierce resistance, as wealthy bankers, Asher Meshulam and his brother Chaim, who rented the resplendent Ca Bernardo Palace in the Paris of San Polo, were able to stop the Jews' relocation. However, in March 1516, the Venetian Senate passed legislation calling for the Jews' rehousing on the city margins. Sanudo does not specify why the Senate selected this new location, but he indicates that the Jewish community leaders feared for their safety on the remote islet of Giudecca. It seems that in the construction of the Venice ghetto, what constituted residential restrictions came with certain geographical restrictions. The placement of the ghetto was an act of shifting boundaries in Venice's urban form, an architectural rethinking of outsider status that marginalized the Jews without strict seclusion. Displacement in Venice compelled the Jews' separation from the center of the city, but it did not require their isolation on the Giudecca. Instead, the Venetian Senate folded the Jews within city limits with direct contact to the city center. And here I get you a little closer to the ghetto in Merlot's map. The Senate founded the ghetto complex on a remote area of Cannaregio in the Paris of San Girolamo, here labeled, on terrain circumscribed on all sides by narrow canals with no churches or grand palaces. This space was formerly a copper foundry. In this way, the Jews were physically relegated to the city margins on land that was not highly valued because of its distance, as you see here, from the Rialto and from San Marco. After propositions failed to relocate the Jews to Giudecca, the government obliged them to go at once to dwell together in the ghetto on the Cannaregio margins, where there is plenty of room for them to live. Ghetto accommodations were never so capacious, therefore Jews quickly built up. The height of ghetto buildings was even more exaggerated during the 16th century because there were fewer buildings in this area, which was dominated primarily by gardens or 1- or 2-story structures. The ghetto complex, in fact, was anomalous in the urban form, as Venetian residences beginning in the late 15th century traditionally only rose 3 or 4 floors. Even the exchange houses inhabited by Protestant Germans, and here I'm showing you the Fondaco de Tedeschi, or Muslim Turks, and I'm showing you the Fondako de Turkey, situated in the city center along the Grand Canal, did not exceed conventional building heights. Jews built upward against the drag of gravity and the weakness of the soil they were forced to build upon. Though the Jews of Venice were not forced to dwell outside city limits, contemporary diaries, decrees, and travelogues specify the architectural isolation of enclosure built into the ghetto design. Diarist of Renaissance Venice, Marin Sanudo, for example, likened the architectural form of the Jewish ghetto to a castle, which is to be closed off with a wall and drawbridge. They, the Jews, are to have only one gate, which is to be closed so that they remain within, he writes. The formal decree issued by the Senate likewise institutionalized ghetto confinement. And here I'm showing you the foundation of the ghetto in the archival documents from the Archivio di Stato di Venezia. On March 29, 1516, the Venetian Senate ordered all Jews residing in the city to move behind the walls of the Ghetto Nuovo. The decree stipulated that the Jews would be locked into the ghetto at night behind gates and would undergo continual surveillance. Jews could not own ghetto property, therefore they rented their high rent apartments in perpetuity. According to this senatorial decree, ghetto enclosure was necessary to avoid the improprieties and illegalities that surfaced when Jews spread throughout the city. And here I'm going to quote from this document. Given the urgent needs of the present time, the said Jews have been permitted to come and live in Venice. And the main purpose of this concession was to preserve the property of Christians, which was in their hands. But no God-fearing subject of our state would have wished them, after their arrival, to disperse through the city, sharing houses with Christians and going about wherever they choose by day and by night, perpetuating all those misdemeanors and detestable and abominable acts which they are generally known and shameful to describe, with grave offense to the majesty of God and uncommon notoriety on the part of this well-ordered republic. Although previously permitted to visit Venice for a maximum of 15 days a year, Jews settled permanently in the city following the Venetian Republic's military defeat to the League of Cambrai in 1509. The economic opportunities of Jewish settlement benefited the Republic by replenishing the treasury depleted from the war and promoting the development of private credit markets and public finance. Authorities never embraced Jews as full members of the community, but rather as traders in money and merchandise, occupations that induced economic prosperity. Jews thus were tolerated for their utilitas, their utility, as they helped to propel the economy and society ahead toward capitalism. The material effects of the ghetto changed the urban form of Venice when authorities legislated the Jews' compulsory residence. Restoration of the buildings was continually necessary because of the poor quality of ghetto construction. Bricks were the principal building material used in the ghetto as elsewhere in Venice. Brick, together with a soft mortar of lime, could withstand the structural movement typical of Venice. Eastrian stone, a white limestone significantly lighter than marble, was used for the sills, gutters, and door frames. To avoid excessive loads, Jews constructed all public stairwells, ceilings, and partitions separating rooms of timber. Shops, stores, and lending institutions occupied the ghetto's ground floor. And of course, here I'm showing you the pawn shop, the Banco Rosso. To maximize space, this floor was often divided horizontally into two, creating an extra floor with ceilings just under 6 feet that could be used for storerooms, kitchens, or servants' quarters. The elevation of ghetto structures further compounded the building's fragility. Overcrowding, resulting from natural population growth and immigration, caused the Jews to expand their tenements vertically, constructing buildings up to 9 stories around the central campo or public square. A Authorities expanded the ghetto complex in 1541 and again in 1633 with the establishment of the Ghetto Vecchio, which I'm showing you here, and the Ghetto Novissimo on land adjacent to the Ghetto Nuovo. So again, the Ghetto Nuovo was founded in 1516, the Ghetto Vecchio in 1541, and the Ghetto Novissimo in 1633. These extensions to the ghetto complex sought to accommodate the residential needs of Levantine and Podentine Jewish merchants, descendants of Jews formerly exiled from Spain and Portugal, whose engagement in what the documents call pure mercantile activity the Venetian government sought to promote. A symbiotic relationship formed between the Jews and the Venetian government. Tedeschi, or German or Ashkenazi, and Italian Jews in the Ghetto Nuovo earned compensation by working as moneylenders, primarily for the urban poor, selling goods secondhand, and serving as physicians. Levantine and Podentine Jewish merchants in the Ghetto Vecchio and the Ghetto Novissimo engaged in wholesale maritime trade via the Mediterranean, while Venice profited from the growth of its commercial activities and the increased revenue exacted from the Jews as taxes. Tedeschi Jews, the German Jews, remained the most marginalized in the ghetto as their work did not curry the political and economic favor of the Venetians, as did the Levantini, whose direct trade with Venetian and Ottoman territories provided them tax concessions and other privileges. Zoning the mass housing projects of Venice's ghetto complex thus represents the social stratifications of its inhabitants and their economic utility. The urban residential areas of the ghetto, of the Venetian ghetto, segregated living spaces by ethnicity, class, and trade, at least until the early years of the 17th century, when Jews moved more freely between their ghetto spaces. Venetian authorities partitioned the ghetto complex into 3 distinct spaces. Nevertheless, the characteristics of ghettoization for all Jews required curfews and compulsory confinement from 1516 with the founding of the Ghetto Nuovo to 1797 with the final collapse of the Venetian Republic. So that's nearly 300 years of ghettoization for the Jews. Neither exterminating nor exiling local Jews, the Senate displaced them to the margins of the city and forced them to reside in the ghetto. Displacement serves as a site of inquiry precisely because it unsettles notions of place. Authorities permitted Jews safe conducts to dwell in Venice, renewable every 5 or 10 years, with the stipulation that they move behind ghetto walls. The establishment of the ghetto preserved the Jews' position as a legally constituted community. However, the politics of place in Venice required their subordinated status. That is, the divisions of society inscribed into the urban fabric secured the Jews' place through destabilizing politics of displacement. For centuries, Jews remained segregated to an isolated area of the city's margins. Time matters. As noted in the example of the Lazaretto, isolation in Venice was a question of movement in space and in time. Igor Linkoff observes, Venice's plague guardians first merged the notion of Lazaretto, isolation in space, and quarantine, isolation in time. In fact, the isolating policies of Venice, with its focus on sequestration in remote islet plague hospitals and the imposition of 40-day quarantine measures, became widespread practice throughout Europe to combat the recurring threat of bubonic plague. According to Linkoff's study on the science and practice of resilient thinking, Venice was an archetype of resilient management because it was implemented at a systems level that isolated contagion in space and time. Relative to Venice's Lazaretti, the Jewish ghetto is compelling in that it offers conflicting conceptions of isolation. In Venice, the ghetto indeed offered isolation and space. The ghetto distinguished Jews from the Christian community through their isolation in walled enclosures. Benjamin Ravid nuances the term ghettoization to encompass compulsory, segregated, and enclosed housing for the Jews. The ghetto was an architectural apparatus predicated on the confinement and surveillance that displaced Jews into sequestered spaces. However, isolation in the ghetto came with a key. Archival documents specify that 2 keys were to be placed over each of the gates of the ghetto enclosure to give Jews diurnal contact with Venice. As such, the Jews' temporal isolation was scheduled and regulated. The 17th century Venetian rabbi, Leon Moldena, writes in his autobiography that was compiled between the years 1617 and 1648, that the social interactions between Jews and Christians were active in the ghetto. His autobiography, The Life of Judas, describes the permeability of ghetto walls during the daytime hours when the ghetto doors remained open. Jews ventured out to shop, gamble, visit Christian friends, and teach Christian children, while Christians entered the compound, the ghetto compound, in search of loans and trade. After nightfall, however, the Venetian government attempted to restrict social contact, specifically sexual contact, between Jews and their Christian counterpart. Ghettoization evolved in Venice as a nocturnal pursuit. Venetians locked Jews up at dusk and guarded ghetto gates at the moment when vision was hindered and suspicions of physical contact between Christians and Jews was at its highest. Threats to the body and the soul were thought to multiply as the sky turned black as pitch, when nighttime transgressions were invisible to the naked eye. Because the darkness of the night offers everyone the possibility of doing evil, declared Venice's Council of 10, the city had to defend the boundaries of night from potential unruliness. Night generated anxieties in the 16th century imagination that afforded Jews the darkened streets to harm their Christian neighbors. Night obstructed sight, thereby fomenting anxieties of Christian vulnerability and Christian viability. And here I'm showing you 2 details from Paolo Uccello's predella panel of the Miracle of the Profaned Host. A predella panel is a thin narrative panel that's placed below an altarpiece. In this case, the altarpiece is the Corpus Domini altarpiece in Urbino. This scene, this predella is separated into 6 scenes, and I'm only showing you the second and third scene, but I'll just mention that the first scene is set in a pawnbroker's, in a pawn shop, in a Jewish pawn shop, in which a Jew has received the Eucharist from a Christian. In the second scene, which I'm showing you here, the Jew has placed that Eucharist in a pan which bleeds the blood of Christ, and we could see the blood issuing forth into Christian space as Christians attempt to break down the Jew's door. And we see his wife, his pregnant wife, and 2 children looking on in terror. In the next scene, we see what happens to that Eucharist. The Pope, in his distinguishing tiara and robe, process to an altar that has miraculously appeared in the countryside, which looks a lot like Urbino, with clerics processing before him and the laity behind. Here, the Eucharist has been saved. And I just wanted to show you that this is a nocturnal scene. Again, we even see this detail of a crescent moon above. To allow Christians to sleep more soundly, Venetian authorities passed legislation that prohibited the Jews' passage into the night. The magistrates, known as the Katz, punished those Jews found outside ghetto walls after hours. The penalty obliged the Jews to pay 100 lire for the first offense, 200 lire for the second, and 500 lire in 2 months in prison for the third. Jews experienced an instability of space when Jewish Venice transformed from day to night. Venetians barricaded Jews behind ghetto walls after dusk to identify the outsiders living within city limits, to create the conditions of an internal urban exile that spatially designated the city's religious others. To abscond from the ghetto at night and to defy that difference came at a cost. Ghetto walls thus played an integral role in the spatial production of nocturnal Venice. When senators passed legislation in 1516 that mandated the Jews segregated housing in the Ghetto Nuovo, here denoted in pink, they emphasized the spatial integrity of the walls enclosing the ghetto complex. And here I quote, "Furthermore, 2 high walls shall be built to close off the other 2 sides of the ghetto, which rise above the canals, and all the quays attached to the said houses shall be walled in." When authorities expanded the ghetto compound with the establishment of the Ghetto Vecchio in 1541, here denoted, of course, in green, the Cinque Save alla Mercanzia, or the Board of Trade, required the city to, and here again I quote, "to connect with the walls along the right and left side of the ghetto along the Cannaregio. In this wall, a door shall be made to enter and exit. This wall shall continue along the boundaries of the said ghetto in order that there is no exit along the Cannaregio other than this door." On August 3rd, 1560, Jewish residents in the overcrowded Ghetto Nuovo submitted an appeal to the Cinque Save to move to the Ghetto Vecchio. The magistrates approved the request with the condition that windows, balconies, and doors of the Jews' home, abutting Christian houses, be walled in, and a wall erected of equal height and length so as to block the Jews' views. In March 1633, the Cinque Save established the Ghetto Novissimo, here labeled in orange, when authorizing the construction of 20 new apartments adjacent to the Ghetto Nuovo for wealthy Levantine and Podentine Jews. Although the Ghetto Novissimo residences were more comfortable and more ornate than the tenement apartments of their Jewish neighbors, enclosing walls remained an essential element in their construction. The Cinque Save required that the Ghetto Novissimo homes maintain the strictures of residential isolation before any Jew was permitted to move into those new spaces. The history of ghetto construction in Venice reveals how enclosure was maintained by the walling up of available surface that gave Jews access to the night. In the case of the Jewish ghetto, isolation in space came with certain specific time restrictions. Isolation within the Venice ghetto endeavored to promote commercial interactions with Christians when the ghetto remained open, and to prohibit forbidden nocturnal interrelations when guards closed the ghetto gates. Ghetto enclosure was defined by the deliberate movement of its gates. The isolation of the Jewish ghetto in Venice restricted the Jews spatially, but temporarily offered them access to the city through the daily opening and closing of its gates. The Venetian ghetto reorganized the spatial and temporal qualities of the urban nightscape to assuage Christian fears. Night was not a neutral category, but an expression of power whose measured limits were imprecise and policed. Maintaining law and order required authorities to patrol Venice's shadowy streets to ensure that from sundown to sunrise, the labyrinth of the city was protected from darkness. In Venice, as in other early modern Italian cities, the Signore di Notte, or the officers of the night, patrolled the dimly lit city, their presence symbolizing governmental control over the night. The archival records in Venice related to the civil and criminal branches of the Signore di Notte indicate no significant Jewish nocturnal activity. Some of the documented cases involved reproaches against Jews engaged in the selling of secondhand goods from trading in new items, warnings against breaking and entering, and allegations of petty theft. Although the Signore di Notte did not frequently hold Jews on suspicions of nocturnal malfeasance, the Senate remained concerned of Jewish nighttime abuses. Venetian authorities used architecture to demarcate Jewish difference into house nocturnal estrangements. Architectural confinement redefined the role of marginality in discourses of space and the role of space in discourses of the night. Whereas the lazaretto confined patients to quarantine quarters until they recovered, the ghetto remained distinctly porous. Even the nocturnal boundaries of Jewish Venice came with manifold exemptions. Marin Sanudo remarks on July 29, 1516, only 4 months after the establishment of the Ghetto Nuovo, legislation passed that permitted Jewish doctors to leave the confines of the ghetto in order to visit patients and attend medical gatherings late into the night. Levantine and Podentine Jewish merchants upon settlement in Venice's ghettos also received special dispensation from the Cinque Stelle to have nighttime access to the seas for their commercial needs. Because the Cinque Stelle had concerns that residential emigre merchants, Jews and others, traded in stolen objects and smuggled goods at night to avoid paying customs, Venetian officials legislated a system of checks and balances to secure the reliability in market practices. The Katz even temporarily released Jews from the ghetto during times of the plague, thereby sanctioning a Jewish presence throughout the city's districts when infection was at its highest. With the ghetto's spatial restrictions came the constant surveillance of guards who left detailed records of all licensed Jews leaving their residence after dark. The conditions of this privilege stipulated that Jews had to verify their whereabouts the following morning to the city magistrates or undergo investigation and punishment. When the government granted Jews privileges to stay outside ghetto after curfew, stipulations specified that they were to avoid forbidden spaces, presumably referring to brothels and the houses of respectable Christian women. The ghetto gates that swung open at night to allow in wealth from maritime trade or to allow out help for the infirm shut tight to guard against the sexual contact between Jews and Christians. Illicit sexual activity was strictly forbidden. Ghetto walls sought to separate Christians and Jews. Such separation served to protect not only Venice's commercial interests, but also the city's sexual honor. The nighttime lockdown of Jews within ghetto walls acted to avert sexual forays between Jew and Christian. Preventing sexual contact between Christians and Jews was hardly original to 16th century Venice. What was new was the use of architecture to prohibit it. Ghettoization sought to control cardinal lust under the cover of darkness. The ghetto provided the order and organization to polarize the sundry bodies of Venice by limiting the mobility of the Jew's body on the nocturnal streets. If night provided the fertile ground for sexual encounter, the ghetto prevented such interfaith contact. The Katz permitted Jews only a brief encounter with nocturnal Venice, requiring them to return to the ghetto at a specific hour of the night. At times, Jews transgressed this license. In September 1609, Rachel Ebrea Canterina, accompanied by her brother Marco and her father Jacob, was granted permission to leave the ghetto after curfew to sing in the homes of respectable members of society. Instead of entertaining Venetian patricians and citizens with song, Rachel and her family were found eating, drinking, and behaving dishonestly with Christian commoners. And that's the language from the documents: eating, drinking, and behaving dishonestly. Authorities viewed this incident as an affront to God and a bad example to all. Nevertheless, Rachel continued in this vein when in June of 1613, she was found singing around Venice in gondola at night without the proper permission. The nocturnal anxiety Rachel provoked motivated civic and moral censure when she gained unregulated contact with darkened Venice. Women in the urban spaces of early modern Europe often experience a nightlife set within the home. In 17th century London, aristocratic men enjoyed nighttime leisure in the city's public houses and cafes, whereas their wives strengthened social networks with visits to the homes of other landed gentry. In this nocturnal scenario, class and gender play a role in designating entry into the city night. From Paris to London, Vienna to Leipzig, non-noble women out after dark for work or for play raised suspicions of unrestrained female sexuality and awakened a nighttime temptation difficult to restrain in men. Men occupied the piazza and its public architecture, while women were ensconced within the private interior. To be sure, exemptions existed that allowed women out during the day. The Italian humanist Francesco Sansovino records in his 1581 Guide to Venice that patrician brides traveled in gondola when visiting family members sequestered in convents throughout the city. In Corneto, outside Rome, women entered town halls to testify before the tribunal, despite the fact that statutes barred their entry into that communal palace. In Florence, lower class women worked within and outside their homes in textile markets, food production, and local inns. While in Venice, women of the laboring class sewed canvas sails for the Arsenale. The gender geography of women at times permitted access beyond the home. Nevertheless, leaving the home at night remained a privileged pursuit. A woman could not stray from her home at night for fear that the ensuing intrigue would tarnish the reputation of the honorable men related to her. Night did not support women's public presence without incrimination. Local ritual permitted patrician women and an occasional escorted excursion, but unaccompanied women provoked association with night-walking prostitutes. Certainly, Rachel did not possess the social standing to legitimate her moonlit forays. Despite legislative exclusions prohibiting Jews' physical contact with the nocturnal world outside the ghetto, in the darkness, Rachel rediscovered her siren powers of voice and the delicacy of her touch when encroaching on Venice's sexualized borders. As exemplified in this case, the law could not prohibit the very mingling it sought to produce. Lisa Pon reminds us that the word isolation contains isola, of course, the Italian word for island. With respect to the plague-stricken, isolation was defined by the sequestration of the sick or potentially sick on remote lagoonal islands during a quarantine of approximately 40 days. In this way, the lazaretto isolated patients in space and in time. Separation was a temporary response to epidemic disease. Venice's ghetto instead permanently secluded Jews on the Cannaregio margins. That isolation, nevertheless, was a nocturnal endeavor. The lazaretto and the ghetto may have been designed to isolate residents considered dangerous to the larger Venetian population, but the form of that isolation differed in conception and execution. In the Venice ghetto, the spatial boundaries of isolation remained temporally porous. Despite allegations circulating Europe that indicted Jews as agents of pollution that spread syphilis, leprosy, plagues, and other diseases, the ghettoization policy in Venice had less to do with anxieties over infectious disease than with suspicions over interfaith sexual encounters. Venice employed spatial reinforcement to protect the sexual boundaries of the nocturnal city and the bodies, Jew and Christian, that set those boundaries in motion. Thank you.
Sorry, I was having a little trouble with my camera, but Dana, fascinating. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. and very, enlightening, and learned a lot. I wanted to throw open, we have a Q&A function at the bottom, and I already do have a few questions, so maybe you and I can talk about it. And actually, I'm going to ask the question that I have about architecture. In the book, one of the phrases at the very beginning, you talk about Venetian gaze and about sight lines and things like that in architecture, which I find very interesting. In the lecture today, you didn't go so much into the fact that there were also restrictions on bricking up windows, or Venetian families having overviews into the Augustinian convent next door of San Girolamo, et cetera. Could you explain a little just to all of us, how that manifested itself, not in just in that way, but also in the architecture, et cetera? Can you go into that just a bit?
Sure, I'm happy to. The whole premise of the book, or what got me thinking about the central concept of the book, was that for me, it was so interesting that, so now the Jews were allowed to live in Venice, but we wanted to place them in the margins to get them out of sight. And so what was interesting is when we placed them on the margins of Cannaregio, the Jews quickly built up so that architectonically, they became a very prominent presence in the city. And what's interesting that during, like, for example, the grand tours, it became instrumental for a proper Englishman in his education to visit the ghetto. It became, it was literally listed on the itinerary of what to do when you went to Venice: go to San Marco, go to a series of churches, and go to the ghetto. So it became part of a prominent viewing center for Venice. But as such, it also became a problem, so that the Jews in their tall towers now had a very dominant view of Venice, which created some consternation. So for example, the ghetto was adjacent to a convent. And the thought was that the Jews could now see into the private spaces of the nuns. And so as a result, there's all this legislation around walls, windows, doors, in order to affirm the notion of clausura, or enclosure. So as a result, you'll see the walling up of doors and windows, et cetera, in order to prevent the penetrating view of the Jews.
Right.
So it is, and that's what got me so interested in the process. All this architectonic language in these archival documents that were trying to separate Jew from Christians. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I think we could talk about the tourism in the ghetto, and it's all of these things, the view and not view that was going on, which is very confusing to the modern eye, but clearly was an important part of it. And the fact that so many of the synagogues, including the Scuola Italiana, was sort of hidden, as it were. I think it's a subject that is probably too big to cover today, but I am getting even more questions. We're getting a lot. So let me go on to one of the other ones, which is Venice has historically been a center for diversity, as there were people from different backgrounds living together, obviously in close quarters. How did the treatment of the Jewish community in Venice compare to people of other backgrounds? And in fact, there was another question, almost the same, pointing out what was the difference between how the Jewish community was being treated and the Ottomans, the Protestant, Tedeschi, et cetera. How does that all fit together? What maybe are the differences, and were there as many differences as we think?
Sure. So yes, Venice, as a result of its placement, had a diverse population. Greeks, Germans, Dalmatians, Armenians, they all lived in Venice. And so, for example, the Greeks and the Dalmatians, some of them lived more closely to the arsenale, or places where they worked. However, what's interesting about the Jews, and I'll also say about the Germans and the Ottomans, or the Muslims writ large, was that was compulsory residence. So just like, for example, the Jews were required to live in the ghetto after 1516, Germans, for example, there had been a German presence in Venice from the 13th century. The Fondaco de Tedeschi dates from the 13th century on. But you'll read in the legislation, for example, the Vis Domini in 1366 required German merchants to live in the Fondaco de Tedeschi. And if they were found outside, they too had to pay a penalty of 50 ducats. And likewise, the Turks, or what they called the Mohammedan nations, which include Persians, etc., they followed the model of ghettoization. They were established later in the 17th century. And just like we were talking about the walling up of available surface, that same language, that same lexicon was used with the founding of the Fondaco de Turkey along the Grand Canal, with walls and windows occluding the Muslim gaze onto Christians.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that the Fondaco de Turkey, and in reading those documents, it was really interesting to see where all the discussion of where they were going to place the building, and then architectonically how they had to modify that building akin to what happened in the Ghetto of Venice in order to block the views of the Muslims. So very much in line.
Wow. Well, another question we're getting a lot of is also a visual question, since that is part of is the title of your book, but it's also about dress. And we know that there are very, in addition to just sumptuary laws, et cetera, and how the visual dress for all levels of Venetian society was a super important thing. People are asking, what was it for the Jewish community? What special garments were required? Obviously, it's again a visual question. If someone's on the Rialto and they're wearing a red hat, I think it was, you can say, oh, he's Jewish. So could you go into a little bit about that?
So there's been a lot of new scholarship on Jewish dress. For example, Flora Casson just published a book on the Jewish badge. So in other places outside of Venice, Jews had, and as well as Saracens, Muslims, had to wear distinguishing garb in order to distinguish themselves from Christians. And so in most places, it was a Jewish badge. It was a yellow circle. In Venice, Jews were made to wear either yellow hats or red hats, and Benjamin Reed talks about that at length. But in order, again, to visually, if the architecture didn't do it, also their clothing did, which was another form of housing the body. Architecture, like clothing, houses the body to make those distinctions. But what's also interesting about dress, and if you ever read, for example, Thomas Coyot's discussion of going into the synagogue. And
it's wonderful.
In 1611. So here you have this Englishman, Thomas Coyot, visiting the ghetto. And I just want to mention, I'm working on a project on Jewish dress right now with a colleague at Georgetown. But what's interesting is that, for example, the Congress in Forli, the Jews themselves got together in the 15th century to say, we are going to wear modest clothing without using a lot of dyes in order not to provoke the envy of Christians. But then you have Coyot visiting the Jewish synagogue during services and seeing the Jewesses bedecked and bejeweled, right? They become this loveliness that is marked not only by their architecture, which again, and we'll talk about this, the synagogue architecture, although it was austere, as you showed in your slide at the start of this event, inside it was sumptuous, right? Just like the women inside were sumptuously dressed, right? And Thomas Coyot goes into detail about how sumptuous and again, how beautiful they were through that material magnificence.
I think they come off the best of all his description of the synagogue, and he compares them. They rival even our English countesses, I think is the phrase, which just shows you, and again, as you were talking about, women weren't necessarily walking about, this was an important, I guess, expression of their, of themselves, dressing up and looking pretty fabulous.
But I did want to mention that the reason that from the 13th century on, Jews were made to wear distinguishing garb, the community knew Jew from Christian, right? This was a way to visually mark them like the ghetto, but to visually mark them as Jewish in the event, for example, if there was a court case of Jew and Christian coming together and having sexual relations. This was a way to say, no, visually they were marked, so there should have been no ambiguity.
All right. We're getting a lot of questions, and I think we can take a few more, but I'm not going to be able to get to all of them today. And I think what we'll do is we'll try to answer as many as we can, maybe by email. I think we can do that. But if we can't, I'm sorry that we aren't getting to every single one. One was asking about a question: was there boat access into the ghetto, or did you have to cross the bridge? And I think the answer to that is yes, but you can disabuse me of that if I'm wrong.
Yes, there was absolutely boat access, and we needed that, right? For the Jews who worked, for example, in the sale of secondhand goods, or even for the moneylenders, they needed access. And they're known as rive, so these little embarking areas that you could get into the buildings. However, it is interesting to read the documents because many of these rive had to be bricked up. And so the Jews had to negotiate with the state which ones had to be bricked up and which one weren't. So yeah, in my book, I'll show you images of these little rive that have now been bricked up. Right. But again, it was just all these little architectural apertures. There was legislation around all of them. If it was from the bottom, from the rive, all the way to altane, those rooftop terraces, there was legislation around all these architectural apertures that gave Jews visual sight lines to the city.
Right. So I'm going to take two more questions. One was what was in general the population, and obviously it fluctuated over many years. I think Koryat says there was something like 6. I don't know if he gives a number, but can you tell us how many people we're talking about?
Yeah, so in the last years of the 16th century, there was about this is estimate, of course, but around 2,000. By the mid 17th century, there was about 3,000. And then in the last years of the Republic, in the late 18th century, it was about 1,500.
Right. So it stayed sort of stable in a interesting way. And then finally, somebody asked a question. I think you mentioned it, but I may not. I may be incorrect. We heard about Rachel, the songstress, who was able, obviously, to leave with permission, even though she broke quarantine, let's say. Very naughty. That's bad. We shouldn't be breaking quarantine, although I'm going to give her a pass because she's probably just having a little dinner with her friends. About the doctors who were a privileged class of people living in the ghetto and obviously needed to have 24-hour access to potential patients or people. So could you explain a little bit about what their situation was?
Yeah, so they received special dispensation at the start of ghettoization. They could leave the ghetto at night whenever they needed to. It was just, again, a question of checks and balances. There was a system to make sure that they were where they said that they were going. So right. Yeah, they had to come back to the Kataveri after each of their nights and justify where they were. But yeah, they needed access to the night, as well as so did the Levantini and Podentine Jews for their commercial needs, right? So they needed access to the seas. Right. So although there was ghettoization, right, it became porous at various moments. Yeah. And I do want to stress, Venice was unusual in its ghettoization of Jews. And you'll see later on, Jews were ghettoized in other spaces, but unlike other places like England and France, where Jews were expelled, or the Germanic territories where Jews were exterminated, right? This was an architectural and urban compromise to create this building. So on the one hand, yes, Jews had lost their privilege, but on the other hand, the situation was much more dire in other parts of Europe.
Yeah. I think if you read some of the, and when Thomas Koryat is in Venice, he's never seen Jewish people before because they were simply expelled by Edward I, I guess. So he was, for him, this was an experience that he'd never had before. As people have asked again about your books, so I'm just gonna give the titles again, and these are available on Amazon. I'm being a shameless plugger for you, Dana. I'm sorry, but I enjoyed reading them. So this is The Jew and the Art of the Italian Renaissance. I think that's 2013. I can't remember the exact date, but 2017, and really relevant to what we've been discussing today, the Jewish Ghetto and the Visual Imagination of Early Modern Venice. So those are both easily findable on Amazon if you guys want to read more. A few more things before we do leave, and I'm gonna, my favorite question actually was, how do I donate to this project? So sorry, now I'm going to plug Save Venice a little bit in the Scuola Italiana. If we could put up a screen just to show you where we are on the campaign right now. Thanks so much. This is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the two main projects for Save Venice's 50th anniversary, 2021, and together with Torcello. And this is so far what we've raised. We've managed to make getting on close to 600,000. It's as you see, $1 million, close to $1 million commitment for Save Venice. Work will be beginning very soon once full work with the Museo Ebraico, et cetera, can be moving forward. I want to thank all of you who have been so supportive. I've had a lot of projects over the years that people really enjoy, but this is one of the things that people have felt the absolute most passion for. If you're interested in helping us reach this goal, you can contact any of my colleagues in the New York or the Venice office, and there you can see the phone number for New York. Most of our listeners are in North America today, so that's probably the easiest thing to do. You can also see some images of the Scuola Italiana in our love letter to Venice, where one of our favorite people in the Museo Ebraico, Marcella Ansaldi, who's the director, talks a little bit about it, and we get to see some interiors. So I highly recommend you guys look at that. We'd love you to be involved in this very historic project. And all that's left for me to do is to simply say thank you to all of you, our supporters. Thank you, Dana. And I certainly hope some of you can join us on our next topic, our next webinar on May 17th about the Church of San Marziale, not very far from where we've been focusing today. Thanks so much again, and please reach out and give us your comments. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.